Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a single brewer review yet again. And this time it's going to be the same style. It's actually the same beer, same year release, but one is barrel aged and one is not. So for today's review, we're jumping over to Heathen Brewing Company. This is a Russian Imperial Stout called Epitaph. Again, the 2019 release. So we're going to be starting with the non-barrel aged version first. This one clocks in at 10% ABV. Heathen Brewing Company is based in Vancouver, Washington. For the second one, like I said, same beer, same style, though this is where it gets a little more interesting than just the barrel. So this is the 2019 release of Epitaph, but bourbon barrel aged, and this one is actually higher in ABV by 2%. This one's 12% versus 10%. So same beer, same company, same year release, but one's standard, a little lower ABV, one's bourbon barrel aged, a little higher ABV. I think this is going to be some very interesting and delicious beer drinking. So we're going to jump right into it, starting with the standard non-barrel aged Epitaph 2019 release, 10% ABV. Okay, so jumping right into the first beer of today's Heathen Brewing Company review, we have got the 2019 release of Epitaph, a Russian Imperial Stout. Heathen Brewing, again, is based in Vancouver, Washington. This first one is not barrel-aged. It clocks in at 10% ABV. As you can tell, this has been wax dipped, so I'm bringing out my trusty bottle opener with this nice can opener in, which has this pointed tip. This is going to help us, as we've done many times now, score right under the edge of the cap along that wax line, and it's going to give us the best chance of clearing out some of that wax so that we can actually grip underneath the cap and lift it off, hopefully the first time. So here we go. Perfect. All right. In terms of label art on this beer, Epitaph, you know, it's got kind of a creepy looking skull on there. They're both similar, just a different color scheme that matches the wax dip and the label color. This one's kind of a caramelly color. The other one's red. So that's the label art. Looks pretty neat. Let's just get this behemoth beer poured right in the glass. Oh yeah, that is thick. That is pitch black. This is a big beer. Though it does look like it's trying to form a decent head. So we got some carbonation in there. I'm hoping I agitated it enough to let it form one. Yes, I did. Okay. Visually, absolutely pitch black. There's not a hint of light getting through that glass. The camera probably is not picking it up, but I can tell you there is a lot of fine, very, very, very fine carbonation bubbles that are still clinging and coming up the side and from the bottom. So I expect it's going to keep working its magic on this head. It looks great. It's not what I would call super lush and creamy, but it formed a nice head on top to be poured at home. I'm sure if you could get this from a CO2 system, or nitro tap rather, at a bar, that it would be even better. But poured at home did a pretty good job. I can tell you already, it does have a pretty pronounced aroma. I can smell rich maltiness as well as a little slight sweetness, maybe molasses-like undertones. But let's get right up on it and give it a proper sniff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it smells very nice. It smells very roasty. There's suggestions of chocolate. There's suggestions of coffee. And there's definitely a dark, rich, fruity side to it. There was a little hint of a molasses one I got right up over it, but I would say much more, it's a very deep roast, marrying with kind of chocolate and coffee overtones, and then rich, deep fruit. Very, very figgy. Very, very figgy. Even candied plums are coming through on the nose on this one. Yeah, it smells fantastic. So, looks the part. Let's jump right in and see what it's about. Oh, okay. Oh man, wow. Wow, that is a very, very, very good Russian Imperial Stout right there. Okay. Okay. The first place my brain went, for better or for worse, I would say for better, was as soon as I swallowed, my brain immediately said to me, North Coast Old Rasputin. For my money, that's among the highest praises anybody could give any Russian Imperial Stout. Everybody knows that one. But the question is, have you tried Heathen's Epitaph? I haven't before today. Now I have. So, are they the same beer? Do they taste the same? No. Do they taste similar? Yeah, they're Russian Imperial Stouts done right. This one's distinctly different. So today being Heathen's Moment in the Sun, we're going to focus strictly on this one. Not necessarily a comparison of what sets them apart, though I think I am going to try to do that side-by-side comparison in a future video. But let's focus on what I'm getting here. As you agitate across the palate, there's really not a lot that hits your taste buds. It's kind of doing its thing and it's coating, but you're not really picking up a ton of flavors until you swallow. And when you do, it is immediate intensity of roast and those deep, rich flavors. So what I was getting on the nose with hints of molasses, coffee, roast, chocolate, fig, and candied plums, they don't all come through clearly on the palate, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Those are overall aromas I would expect that are kind of somewhere between the middle of an Imperial Stout and a barley wine. Not that you would normally find all of those aromas or flavors in a stout. Stouts tend to focus a lot less on the fruity side and a lot more on that roasted edge side, which obviously very deeply roasted grain bill here. And that's what translates into this glass. So it's very intense roastiness. There is a suggestion of like unsweetened chocolate, like bitter baker's chocolate. There is a slight suggestion of coffee, but I wouldn't say this is one that tastes like coffee. There is a little hint of smoke, almost like you would get in an Islay Scotch. So it's a very intense roast of this malt bill, and the flavors pop out with great intensity. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel, think on the flavor development a bit more in the finish. The body on this is a solid medium heavy. Feels appropriate for the style in the ABV range. It's got real breadth to it. The mouthfeel feels quite thick, as I could see when I poured it into the glass. It's definitely got a lot of resistance to it. As you agitate around the palate, it gets very silky. Very, very silky indeed. It doesn't get foamy. It gets creamy, silky, just this supple, silky mouthfeel quality to it. It's just fantastic. On second sip, the flavors have intensified even more. There is a massive, massive amount of roasty malt that comes through in this. I'm getting a little more chocolate after my second sip that's coming through in the flavor. I'm also really starting to get some of those coffee-like flavors that I noticed on the aroma. I'm still not really getting any fruity flavors, which for my money is a good thing in a stout. I like them in a barley wine, not so much in a stout. I don't mind the aroma there. It actually makes it smell a lot more complex in terms of its aroma it's bringing to the table. But translated into the glass, this is a standard Russian Imperial Stout through and through. It's just rich, deep, roasty, roasty, roasty flavors that you're getting here. And that smokiness, it's not a peatiness like an Islay Scotch, but it's not Rauch beer. It's much more akin to the level of kind of smoky hintiness you would get from, say, a French or Italian roast coffee. We've talked about this a lot. That's present in a lot of very big dark beers. But again, it's just subtle coffee notes that are coming through. That kind of smoky, roasty edge to the almost being burned bean side is much more present than the actual coffee flavor itself. So this is tasting very much like a very intense, classic, deep roasted malt bill that is presented in Russian Imperial Stout form, and it's absolutely fantastic. I think they've done a good job here. I got to jump in for one more sip. There's a lot happening here. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything, and then I'll tell you about the finish. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I tell you, this beer just intensifies with every sip. You're hit immediately with just roasty malt. It's got a very grainy quality to it. And then it really does start mixing chocolate and coffee and smokiness into the mix. Again, it's not like Rauch beer smoke. It's nothing like that. It's much more akin to kind of the smoky quality you would get from a French or Italian roast coffee bean. So it's not like barbecue. It's just this almost earthen smokiness to it, which is a very distinct kind of thing that you pick up in Russian Imperial Stouts in particular. You can pick them up in a lot of different beer styles, but that's kind of one of the big things that you get in a Russian Imperial Stout. It's a very deep roast on the malt, and that is translating just wonderfully into the glass. This is a big, intense, complex, just well-executed Russian Imperial Stout. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review. That is Epitaph 2019 Bourbon Barrel Aged version that clocks in at 12% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's Heathen Brewing Company Russian Imperial Stout review. We have got the same beer, but a slightly different twist. This is Epitaph 2019 release again, but this one has been bourbon barrel aged, and it does have a slightly higher ABV at 12% versus 10 on the prior. So slightly higher, but statistically that's significant. That's a 20% increase over the first beer, which is pretty big. As I mentioned in the first video, you'll notice that there's a slightly different color scheme on this one. Same in every way, but different color schemes. The last one was caramel, this one's red. So the label art, it's still got that red kind of skull looking thing on there, and it's got the nice red dipped wax. And they do actually have this really neat, almost like you'd think in medieval times where the king would dip the wax on official correspondence and put their little mark in it. It's got this little insignia in the top. I don't know if the camera's going to pick that up at all, but I'm trying my best to reach as close to the... I'm still several feet away. I apologize, but it's awesome. It's awesome. I'm a big, big fan. All right, so yet again, we're going to score right through the wax, right under the cap. Last one came off first go. This is much kinder wax than I get on a lot of bottles. So it looks great, and it's a nice sealer, but it's actually pretty easy to get through on here. They didn't go overboard, which I personally really appreciate. All right, and we got that crack. Got a little wax that just fell down in, so I'm gonna clean that out. In general, I like to just rub the edges after I get it cracked on a wax bottle because there's little loose pieces that can sometimes drop in your beer. Not the end of the world, it's just wax, but if you're drinking a beer and you get a big chunk of something in your mouth, it can be a little bit jarring, to say the least. It's happened to me before, relatively recently, in fact, but let's go ahead and get this one poured. I'm imagining it's going to look similar. Yep, just the same. Very, very dark, very, very thick. So I'm going to actually be a bit more aggressive with my pour on this one. Last one already did a pretty nice head. I'm going to back off, give that room to work its magic. Yeah, that did a great job. In terms of intensity of aroma, yet again, I can smell it, and I'm a good foot and a half away from the rim of the glass of this beer. It does have a very pronounced aroma. This one, I can tell you, I smell a lot of similar aromas to the first, but that bourbon is distinctly riding on top. So let's hold this up. Visually, yeah, just like the last one is pitch black. I would expect nothing else. In terms of carbonation, though, this one doesn't look quite as insane in terms of what's clinging working its way up. But to be fair, I was a lot more aggressive when my pour on this one. And indeed, it actually paid dividends in how the head formed. This looks a lot creamier, a lot denser pad. So I probably shouldn't have been as gingerly on the first beer. Should have just glugged right down the middle, at least for a portion of the pour. It does help. When you're pouring with a stout, if you want to give it a good chance to form a head, do what I did on the second one here. You know, it's just... sometimes I'm thinking about it, sometimes I'm not. So that's my own fault. But yet again, formed another great head. Let's get right up on it and get a proper sniff. Interesting. Okay, so when I get right up on this one, the bourbon that I was smelling from a foot and a half away, I can still get, but it's not necessarily riding as the dominant aroma. It still comes through clearly. You can absolutely smell the bourbon very clearly, but it's a lot more like the same beer that I just sampled, but with the bourbon mix. So I'm getting the bourbon on the aroma over here. I'm getting roasty undertones, and I'm definitely getting the deep, rich fruit and a little hint of molasses, which again, The fruit and the molasses didn't really make it through in the flavor profile at all in the last beer, but it's interesting to see that it does still basically smell the same, only it's got that bourbon added. So in a nutshell, it smells fantastic. Had to settle down a little bit. Now it's got this nice tight creamy pad floating on top. So let's just jump right in for our first dive. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm loving everything about that. Okay, so while my brain is processing what I just experienced, my gut reaction was just like the first beer. As you're agitating around the palate, you're not really picking up anything. So it's kind of a surprise. It's once you swallow, boom, that's when all the magic hits you. Same thing is true here. And yeah, I gotta say, just like the first beer, but with bourbon. The difference is the bourbon is a much bigger player in this beer, as is true with most barrel-aged beers. As a bourbon barrel-aged beer, it's a big, bold, pungent flavor. It definitely is making its mark and its impact. And no, this isn't an identical beer in the experience side, just bourbon barrel-aged. It's actually quite a bit different, and it's not just the bourbon. So, first thing I noticed was the intensity of the roasty edge. All of those really earthy and smoky flavors, they are there still, but they're a lot more subdued with that bourbon writing in the mix as well. So really the bourbon, just like when I was quite a bit of ways, it was kind of the dominant aroma. When I got right up on it, it wasn't. But once I swallowed, for sure, the bourbon is kind of playing up, you know, the center stage position of this beer. And that's not a problem because it's the same beer. The same structure is there. The same enjoyable flavors and aromas are there. But now there's just another element to it, and it's that bourbon. And it makes for a completely different beer drinking experience, though equally enjoyable for my money. So I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel and finish and really think about how these flavors are developing. It's quite nice. It's quite nice. Body on this one, still medium heavy, though the breadth of it is a bit more substantive than on the first. 2% higher ABV, I'm not surprised by that. Mouthfeel, still nice and thick, nice and viscous, and it still gets very silky when you agitate around the palate. In terms of what's happening with the flavors here, and how they finish out. Finish on this one is quite a bit longer than on the first, and 100% it is that bourbon that's driving the length of the finish on each sip. But what comes through in the flavor profile? Well, exactly what I got on the first sip, only again, just as with the first beer, it intensifies and intensifies with each subsequent sip, so I'm getting more and more information here. The roast, it's there, and it is still a very deep roast. Though I gotta say on this one, there's a lot more chocolate notes that are coming out of it, and far fewer coffee notes. There's a little suggestion of coffee-like qualities, but it's got a lot more of the chocolatey, a lot more of the earthy, and still just a little bit of that smoke. Just with the first beer, it's a lot more akin to the roasty edge of a French or Italian roast coffee bean than it has in common with, say, a Rauch beer or like a peated Islay Scotch. It's nothing like that. So there's no barbecue sense, no smoked meat sense to it at all. It's just a really deep roast that borders on the edge of almost coming to flames. So that's where that smoky element is coming, and it's fantastic. And that's a very classic flavor profile in a Russian Imperial Stout. So they absolutely know what they're doing here. They put together a really fantastic beer. They just decided to, you know, take a little different bend and let's barrel age one and see what happens. Well, I'll tell you what happened. The ABV went up, a little more substance came into the beer, and then you still get all the base characters that you get from the non-barrel aged version, but you get the added bonus of that bourbon barrel back. And it's truly delicious, though I can't stress enough how distinctly different the drinking experience is from that first beer. It's not the same beer all over again just from a bourbon barrel. It's not at all. It shares a lot of commonality. The same structure is there. The same bones are there, but it is indeed its own animal. May share the same name, the same base beer, but it is distinctly different from the first beer. So, if you don't like the barrel-aged beers, I might would suggest just try the standard Russian Imperial Stout. If you like that style, you'll absolutely love it. It's delicious and it's beautifully done. If you're a fan of trying all sorts of different things or you prefer a barrel-aged stout, this one for sure is going to be right up your alley because it's got just a beautiful, beautiful Russian Imperial Stout back and then that added bonus of the bourbon barrel, and it truly, truly is delicious. I'm going to jump in for one final sip here. I'm just going to top it off just a teeny weensy bit here. And yes, that head pad is still floating on here beautifully, looking quite nice. Jump in one final sip for final thoughts. Boom, there it is again. Bourbon. And bourbon hits you, and it swells for a few seconds and starts to back down. Then that roasty is coming in. That's where the roasty edge of the malt, the smoke is coming into play. It's all coming in, little bit by bit, a little bit of chocolate. And indeed, the natural sweetness from the bourbon, from the barrels that's imparted in this beer, the chocolate is less of a really bitter, dark baker's chocolate, and it's more semi-sweet territory. It's not super sweet. It doesn't taste like there's lactose dumped in here. It's not like a milk stout drinking experience, but there is some natural innate sweetness to it, and it accentuates the inherent chocolate flavor a bit more. Baker's chocolate, that's much more cacao. This is much more like chocolate. It's got the sugar side, which makes it the chocolate. It's very, very nice. Don't get me wrong, it's still a nice, deep, dark chocolate, but that's the key. It's darker chocolate. It's not milk chocolate. There's less sugar, but there's sweetness enough that, oh, that's not baker's chocolate. That's not cacao. That's actual chocolate. That's what it tastes like. And there's just this little kiss of a coffee bean. It almost tastes like a coffee cherry, the unroasted bean. If you've ever had those or had those chocolate dipped, that's almost what this tastes like to me. It really, really is nice. And yeah, everything that was in the first beer is still here. It's just a little dialed back in the intensity of the roasty edge side. It's playing a little much more on the sweeter end of the spectrum due to that bourbon barrel. And there's this beautiful bourbon boozy kiss. And when I say boozy kiss, I mean boozy in the sense that you can taste that distinct barrel characteristic. There's not a big alcohol bite. There's no real alcohol ethanol flavor to it. It's just you understand that from what the characteristics of the barrel are imparting onto the beer. And yeah, there is this nice little warming sensation that you get from the barrel. Very common with barrel-aged beers. It's one of the things that I like about them the most. So yet again, just a home run of a Russian Imperial Stout. Very much the same structure, but a different presentation, and it completely changes the experience. I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just nice to have that variety, and I absolutely love it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to go down and get them ranked. And since it's basically the same beer, same style, just one barrel-aged, one not, sure they had a little different ABV, I'm just going to go down category by category so we can see how they stack up against each other. Yet again, this is Heathen Brewing Company's Epitaph 2019 release, Russian Imperial Stout. 10% on the standard version, 12% on the bourbon barrel-aged version. Heathen Brewing is based in Vancouver, Washington. So starting with the aroma, both of these beers had an absolutely massive aroma that gave you tons and tons of layers on top of it. So it was very roasty, chocolate notes, there were coffee notes. In this one, there were distinct bourbon notes, there were molasses notes, fig notes, dried plums. It was all in there. It was huge and intense. Both beers get a 10 for the aroma. For the taste, while these were essentially the same beer, the beer drinking experience was quite a bit different. Both of them had intensity of flavor. Pretty much exactly what you got in the aroma was translated into the flavor, but with more intensity. The exception being that the fig and kind of the dried plum aromas that came through really didn't translate into flavor at all. It was much more a true classic Russian Imperial Stout in flavor profile, and they both hit home big, exceptionally well balanced, all the flavors across the board. This one, of course, had a big bourbon kick to it as well, but both beers, while different, did still get a 10 for the taste. For the body, both of these had an absolutely massive, very, very medium heavy, bordering on heavy body, 10% and 12% respectively. They pretty much sat exactly where I expected. They both get a 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, same story here. You could see how thick it was when I was pouring it. There was a ton of resistance to this beer. It felt right for the style and the ABV range. They both get a 10 out of 10 for the mouthfeel. Moving on to the finish. This is where we got a little bit of our first differences in scores. So the finish on the first beer was above average for the style, to be certain, but you know, it didn't last a super crazy long time in the grand scheme of things. On the other hand, this one, the intensity of the bourbon paired with the intensity of the other flavors was really so great that it really helped extend the end of the finish out on the bourbon barrel aged one compared to the standard. So standard for the finish gets a 7, the bourbon barrel aged version gets a 9. Moving on to the head and retention, both of these did a very good job to be poured at home, much higher than average, didn't miss top marks by much, though there was a slight better head creation and retention on the bourbon barrel aged one, and honestly I think that was mostly due to I was very vigorous pouring this one. This one I wasn't quite as vigorous, but other than that they were more or less identical. Just a slight deviation in how vigorously I poured. So an 8 for the standard version, a 9 for the bourbon barrel aged version. Moving on to the appearance, both beers were absolutely pitch black, exactly as expected. They both get a 10. For the balance, I mentioned this during the tastings of both of these, but the balance of the ingredients were absolutely fantastic. You could taste every independent layer. It was classic Russian Imperial Stout, just done right. And the bourbon in this one came through, but it didn't overpower. So still bourbon barrel aged, but equally well balanced as the first. They both get a 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible, I loved both beers. I really did. It's one of my favorite styles, to be certain, and they really nailed it. And the bourbon aged barrel version really was just having a little extra, slightly different twist. But they both were fantastic. 10 out of 10 from me. Finally, as an example of the style, Russian Imperial Stouts, there's not a ton of them out there in the marketplace. Sure, you can find them. They're not, you know, as hard to find as, say, a barley wine is. But you know, there's not an inundated marketplace with them. So finding a new Russian Imperial Stout is always very special indeed. And I thought that both of these were very special. Scored very high across almost all categories across the board. And they both deserve top marks here as well. A 10 as an example of the style for both beers, which brings the total scores on Heathen Brewing's Epitaph 2019 and the same beer but bourbon barrel aged to a 95 and a 98 respectively. These are both absolutely top tier beers. Same beer, slightly different twists, slightly different ABVs, but for all intents and purposes, the same beer just in a slightly different twist. Really depends on what you're craving. If you want the standard, you cannot go wrong with this. If you like that barrel aged back to it, same thing with the barrel aging, was phenomenal. Both beers I highly recommend, well worth seeking if you can find them. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.